Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, and this is Legal Matters, the program that's been designed to address some critical, contentious, and in this case, very timely issues that are facing businesses and consumers today. It's legal information, practical solutions, and straight talk about a wide variety of issues that are affecting you. We're joined once again by Jackie Grasso and David Bazar from Audette, Bazar, Cordiero, Grasso Law Firm in East Providence. And we've, in the past few weeks, covered some pretty timely topics, most recently E-Verify. Today we decided that in view of the bad weather that we've had, it's caused some interesting conversations to evolve, namely traffic laws and how they're affected, and good neighbor laws, or maybe not good neighbor laws. How about liability laws? Just how much are you supposed to shovel? So you would think that people are aware that they should just slow down, that their speed should decrease, the space between cars should increase. Does anybody get a pass because of bad weather if there's an accident? What's the law? What goes on?
Well, if somebody gets in an accident, bad weather or not, they have a duty to report it within 21
Right.
days. But an accident is an accident. I don't know that they'd be charged with reckless driving.
Well, it
because of
depends
the road
on the
conditions.
situation. There's a number of traffic laws that would come into effect. The driving with a reasonable speed under the conditions.
Yeah.
So if you're going too quickly, even if you're within the speed limit, but the conditions would require a prudent driver to drive more slowly, and you don't, and you have an accident because of that, you can be charged as violating that law.
Is it arbitrary? If the speed limit's 45 and it's bad weather and there's an accident and someone was traveling 40, could they still be driving too fast? Who decides that? How does that?
Well, the initial
Become
decision
determined.
will be made by the police officer who does the investigation. And the criminal side of it, if you will, even though a ticket's not a crime per se, it's a violation, there's also the legal side for liability. Will someone be civilly liable if they cause an accident in conditions that are adverse? And some insurance companies who are defending those cases may take the position that it's an act of God that caused the accident, and therefore there's no liability. But as a lawyer, what I would look at is what would a reasonable and prudent person have done under the circumstances, and if you did everything that's reasonable, and perhaps because of an act of God, the weather, created a situation that nobody could have avoided, maybe there isn't liability. But oftentimes, that's the first response from an insurance company, but upon closer examination, there are things that people could do. For example, we had a case once that came to us where our client was driving down a big steep hill with ice on it, and they started sliding, lost control of their car for a period of time, but then regained it and stopped it at the bottom of the hill. Well, the next car came down and did the same thing. And the insurance company's response was, well, it was an act of God. Look what happened to your client. Our client did the exact same thing. No liability. My response to that was, your client saw my client slide down that hill. They knew, therefore, it was very slippery at the time that they undertook to go down the hill. If my client had seen someone else and still went, they would be liable. Your client's liable for not
Due care, yeah.
exercising due
Well, if
care.
you're midway down the hill and you see that someone was sliding, you don't always have an option to take another road if you're in the middle of that hill or whatever. Maybe you might have a
Right.
side street, but if you don't, then...
That would have been a different situation.
Okay.
You know, and if their argument was that there's nothing else they could have done, and this is what every reasonable and prudent person would have done under the circumstances, I agree. But if they could have gone left or right at the top of the hill and gone around this street that was not passable at the time, then they should have.
So what David's talking about is a little law called the Last Clear Chance law, Last Clear Chance statute. So, for instance, if a woman goes through a red light and hits me, I have an obligation to look over to see if this person is coming towards me, and I would have the obligation to try and avoid the accident.
Right.
Correct?
Yeah,
Last clear chance.
As long as you don't do something that's illegal at the same time, right?
Yeah.
But let's assume, Jack, what Jackie's saying, to put it in perspective, is someone's driving along, it has a green light, and they see the car going through the red light, and they could have stopped to avoid the car going through the red light, but they said, no, I have the right of way. Well, they had the last clear chance to avoid that
They could have
accident.
stopped. But in the situation with ice, like Debbie was saying, you may not have been able to stop.
Right.
So that wouldn't have applied. in
Right,
that
so
situation.
that's why you have to look at the facts of each case. There are a number of different types of situations that can arise because of snow and ice on the roads. What about the person who keeps their car outside? The car is covered with snow, they clean off the windows so they can see out, but they leave all the snow on. Now they're driving along and something flies off their car and hits the car behind them, maybe breaking the windshield or covering the windshield of the other car so they can't see. Is that person liable for that? And Jackie, would,
Sure, well, on a theory of negligence, and then we have a law that says
Right.
you have to remove any debris on the car.
right.
Apparently, I think that's true, or I've heard of that being true of trucks who certainly have, or SUVs, who accumulate an awful lot of snow that they sometimes can't even physically reach. And so they drive without trying to attack it and get rid of it, and then you see it flying at with
It's
50
dangerous.
miles an hour, and
Right.
then it becomes a trajectory that causes some trouble.
So to approach that from the civil side, can I sue that person? I'll take that, Jackie can talk about the violation side, but the civil side is, if that's what a reasonable and prudent person would do, and now there's some argument on whether or not it is what a reasonable person would do, but it's what they should do, is to clear the ice and snow off, because you know once it starts moving along and you have the wind coming from your speed and it blows it back, it's dangerous, you should do that. There's also a requirement from the ordinance or state law rules, right?
It has to be removed.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a, you
Oh,
could be
yeah,
charged
you can be
with...
charged, yeah, you can be ticketed for it.
Right. A state trooper sees you coming down the road with an igloo with wheels on it,
Yeah,
you might be charged.
yeah.
So
I think they can be charged with reckless driving, no?
Possibly, depending on what happens in the situation.
So back to the speed situation. I guess it was February 4th when there was, it wasn't state, but when there was a serious snowstorm, Captain Pereira, I believe, made a comment that drivers, excuse me, should be going 5 to 10 miles an hour slower. Well, if you didn't go 5 to 10 miles an hour slower, does that mean that you were absolutely negligent if something happens? Do you end up with trouble because you didn't go 5 to 10 miles slower, even though he said it? Does that make it, his saying it, make it law?
Well, two different
Well,
issues.
no, I think it was just a matter of judgment. He's saying, be careful, the roads are bad.
Which is
But
reasonable.
going back to what David said, what's a reasonable and prudent person to do in that situation if you're in bad weather?
Right. And so there's the violation again.
Yeah.
That's the driving under the conditions at a reasonable and prudent speed. He's put that out there. The traffic is having difficulty moving because of the weather, and you're in the high-speed lane moving along at the speed limit, passing everybody. That may be unreasonable under those circumstances. A state trooper may violate you for doing that, give you a ticket, give you a citation. If you have an accident, the question you asked is it negligence? And negligence on the civil side is, well, it may be negligent to do that, but there's not a negligence case against you or a tort until that causes an injury. So if you cause an accident because of that, you hit somebody who stopped in front of you because now you can't stop, even though you were going at a reasonable, prudent speed, but not a reasonable, prudent speed, but the speed limit, and now the cars are stopped in front of you and you can't stop, now that negligence has transformed itself into a civil tort case because you've injured somebody.
Let's follow up with that a minute. A couple of other scenarios that I just read about very recently. Say you did end up observing that there's bad driving conditions, you lessened your speed, and in one case, someone suddenly came across black ice. You wouldn't always know that there's black ice, you might surmise it, but if you suddenly hit a patch of it and you cause an accident, how do you get to prove that it was that black ice, and how does that affect what that accident looks like?
Well, we as
to the other
lawyers
side?
have access to weather conditions anywhere in
Right.
the United States and particular dates
Sure.
and times. How do you get to prove it?
Well,
You have to take a picture from your iPhone?
that's not a bad idea.
That's not a bad idea.
Anytime you have an accident and you have the ability to do that, to show different things, you should. But it raises, you have to look at the facts of each case. And let's take that back and compare it to the case I talked about with the hill. Well, the first person going down that hill that slid, that didn't know it was that bad, call it black ice if you will, I would argue that person was not negligent if they hit somebody at the bottom of the hill because they had no way to know what it was like. So what was reasonable under the circumstances? I go down that hill every day, it looks clear. I don't know there's black ice on there, I hit somebody. How do I prove it? Well, your testimony is your evidence. How the car went down is evidence. You know, the slipping and sliding. Cars don't normally do that if you're driving, you know, at a reasonable speed. The second car doesn't get that defense, I don't think, because that car now knows and is put on notice that there is black ice. So black ice that you can't see, because that's what, I guess, by definition it is, right?
Yes.
And that you have no reason to know exists, might be a defense.
And if there is also snow around, in addition to some black ice underneath it, about that iPhone or that takes that photo, or your cell phone that takes that photo, should you get out of that car and then start photographing that black ice, the pattern, if you have a movie, iMovie, or video capabilities, the sliding path, should you be doing that yourself? And then give it to your favorite lawyers?
First, you want to make sure nobody's injured.
Yes, of course.
And call an ambulance,
Right.
911, then you have to call the police. You have an
Yeah.
obligation to report it to the police.
Right. And make sure everybody
Yeah.
is safe to do that at that point in time.
Yeah, and if somebody feels that he or she's truly going to be liable for this, and they feel as though they have a legitimate defense, that's probably not a bad idea.
Right. I mean, I can give an example of just a regular, not a weather-related accident, where this fellow was involved in an accident. He was going to turn left, and a car was coming in a one lane in that direction with a blinker on to turn, so he begins to turn. The other car behind that person, unbeknownst to him, went over the double yellow line and hit him as he was turning. So he took pictures of it, because it would have been his word against theirs. They would have said he turned left in front of them, and the point was he actually had photographs of the accident being in the other lane, where the car was over the double yellow line, and had photos where the points of impact where the cars were still there. He would have lost that case potentially otherwise.
Okay. And what about, as we hear, there are so many multi-car accidents now. You know that the first person who made the impact then ended up causing the second, the third, the fourth.
Yeah, I had a case like that, and I actually had a problem with the insurance company, because my person was the one who was rear-ended by a car,
Okay.
which caused her to go forward and rear-end the car in front of her.
And-
so my
and so
position
on,
was,
and so on.
but for the first person hitting her, she would never have run into the car in front of her. The insurance company did not want to pay on the claim because they said she was negligence. And it took me about maybe a year to a year and a half, and finally I was able to convince them that this was not her fault.
Right.
You know, and she got injured pretty badly.
Sometimes cases like that, you have to put them in suit, and you have to start
exactly
deposing
what you have to do.
everybody in line. And the car in front of Jackie's client, if that person's going to testify, I only felt one impact, because it's not as if Jackie's client hit them, then she got hit again and pushed in, which would have been two impacts. It goes a long way to determining what happened. So sometimes a case, you know, a lot of times it's, this is what happened, and here's what the police report
Cut and
says,
dry, yeah.
cut and dry. But a lot of times the police report is either wrong, or it doesn't have all the information you need, and clients come to me, I'm really worried this police report's wrong. Well, that happens a lot. We'll deal with that. We'll get the witnesses to
And
it.
that's what you end up doing. You end up corralling
No,
witnesses.
at times,
to
if
Right.
you can always go back to the police department and ask them to correct the
Right.
report. And
Sometimes they will.
They'll leave out, for
Right.
instance, that there was a passenger in the car,
Right.
something like that, that's important.
Or what side of the road the accident
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
happened on.
Yes, and then I have, forgive me, but I have to ask this. How about people who are very aware that rear-end accidents cause whiplash under the best of circumstances, but it's very easy for someone who wants to scam the system to say, maybe help along the possibility that someone's going to rear-end them so that they can then say, I have whiplash. How do you, as a defensive driver, protect yourself against the fact that somebody may want to pose such a scam? What can you possibly do?
Drive carefully and don't hit the person in front of you.
Yes, but sometimes things happen. Suppose that person just
Saying
slams
they-
on the
they
brakes just a
deliberately
little bit too quick. They do
Right.
something deliberately to cause it,
And
and
I
then say it's your
understand
fault.
that, and it's what I tell my daughter all the time, who just got her license. You have to leave enough room for anything to happen. That person could have just jammed their brakes on because something came out in the road, or they could have jammed their brakes on because they wanted to try to cause an accident. Leave enough space, so that can't happen. What actually I think maybe more of a fraudulent type of situation is if you're stopped and someone intentionally backs into you and then tries to claim that you hit them. That's, you know, where you might have some issues and you have to be able to prove somehow
How
that.
do you do that? Is that
You've got to
another?
find witnesses.
You have
Yeah.
to find witnesses. And is it the driver's responsibility to try to get out of the car and, assuming no one's hurt,
Right.
although someone may say afterwards that
Right.
he or she was, is it the driver's responsibility to get out and try to say, did you see this, did you see
Yeah,
this, can I
I-
have your name, your number?
Absolutely.
Matter
You
of
know-
fact, by law, they have to exchange their information,
Right, but-
registrations, license.
But in terms of getting factual witnesses, car behind you, the car in
Ask-
front,
yeah,
you've got to
if there's
just try.
anybody near you. Get a name, get an
Right.
address, yeah.
Okay, if not the moving violations, snow bans. They set them out early. If you're watching television, read the newspaper, online, you can see that they're there, going into effect at 2 or 4 or 6 or whatever time it is. What happens if there's an accident because there's someone that's already been off the road or on the road and it's now too narrow? What happens if you don't abide by the bans? What happens? What's the ticketing
Right.
process?
Parking
What are
Are
the
you saying that
consequences?
there's a car
Parking ban,
parked?
yeah.
Car parked.
Okay, and because the car is parked there, it makes the road much narrower,
Right.
and somebody
Right.
Somebody
gets into an
sideswipes.
accident. I think you could legally
And
make
she's
it.
saying that the car's parked there in violation of
Yeah.
a parking ban.
Yes.
Well, first of all, they'd be cited for parking
Mm-hmm.
during a parking ban, and on the civil side, I would take the registration, license, I'm sorry, not the registration. first thing
license
up,
plate, yeah.
License plate, and as a, as a civil attorney
Right.
on that, I would definitely think there's
Yeah,
some
I-
causation for negligence there.
There's two
Negligence.
reasons
Yeah.
for the parking ban that you can look at. Obviously, one is so they can plow the roads.
Yes.
That's the main reason. But also, it's a safety issue, and as Jackie's saying, if someone's parking there and we can show that that helped cause this accident because the person had no way to avoid it, there might be liability,
And you may
even
get,
though your car is parked.
Good to know.
oh, what's happening
But,
now. Getting towed.
you're supposed to be careful when you're driving, even with those obstacles that are out there. So it's not a great case, but if your car is parked during a parking ban where it's not supposed to be, that is also the violation is going to result in the car being towed, and you're going to end up in front of Jackie or whoever the municipal court
David.
judge is in the town.
David. Okay, any other scenarios that you want to bring up about the traffic accidents? Because the next one is snow removal, which is another very big issue. Do you have any other
Well, the
scenarios?
only
you
other
want to
thing I want to maybe just mention, a hypothetical, which actually is loosely based on some facts of a case we had once, is there's a snow storm coming, massive snowstorm, and a few years back, actually, one where the governor declared a state of emergency. So our client, let's just say hypothetically, is out driving in the state of emergency, and it's a backcountry road, and he's going around the corner, his side of the road at the speed limit, doing what he's supposed to do, and all of a sudden, two plow trucks in tandem come around this two-lane highway, and one of them's in his lane because they're plowing in tandem and hits him. Is he going to be liable to his passenger? Is the tow truck, the plow company's going to be liable? Who's responsible for that? That's what you could face in this situation.
And who rightfully can be on the road during a state of emergency, only
Right.
state officials, correct?
Well, here's the thing.
That's the question.
That's what the plowing companies tried to allege, is that they had no right to be on the road. It was a state of emergency. The state of emergency didn't carry with it a requirement to remain in your houses. It was a request from the governor.
And there is a difference.
There is a difference. There's no curfew or ban or from driving or any of that. It's a state of emergency, which is declared for certain reasons financially for the state, but also no requirement to stay off the road. And what if my client had an emergency? They had to be somewhere. Maybe she's pregnant and is going to deliver. Does she have to stay home? It wasn't required. So he's out on the road legally, even though there was a state of emergency. The plowing company, the trucks, are over the double yellow line. They're driving illegally. It was our position that they're responsible for this accident. And eventually, actually, my client did prevail. She collected a little from her driver, but mostly from the plowing company because they're over the double yellow line. Now, that's typical. That's what they do sometimes in these roads, tandem plowing, but they have to be cautious and reasonable.
And wouldn't you think that if they see that there are there's other traffic on the road, that they wouldn't do that? If there's no one on the road, then
Right.
don't take your lane out of the middle and not a
Right.
problem, but certainly under those
Right.
circumstances.
This was on a
that sounds-
curve, so they might not have been able to see that, but maybe you don't tandem plow going around a curve when you don't know what might be out in front of you.
Blinding snow, you might not even be able to see where that double yellow line is.
Right.
And then And then do
Well,
the case?
that may have been part of what was playing in this other case, and maybe why our client's driver may have had some of the liability as well.
Good to know. Okay. It's nice to be a good neighbor and plow your driveway, maybe your neighbor's driveway, but in the cities, there's a law that says you're supposed to also make a clear passageway for the sidewalk. Sounds like a nice thing to do, but is it actually illegal to not do that? And what are the consequences if you don't?
Well, I think you go back to the safety issue. The
Right.
city of Providence is always in the news because of this, and just recently they are. If they have a town ordinance that says you're supposed to keep your sidewalk free from debris, or shovel it in a snowstorm, then they can enforce the ordinance.
Right.
The concern is that you have elderly people who can't even get out of their homes,
And
let
then-
alone shovel their sidewalk. So are they really going to enforce that against somebody who has a disability, who's incapable of shoveling their sidewalk? Okay.
Well, it's two...
Revenue source if they do try to collect on that, I
Well,
suppose.
There's two thoughts there, though. Number one is the person is responsible for getting it done. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to do it themselves. So hire somebody.
And if
Now,
they don't have the financial resources.
then be a good neighbor and do it for them.
Yeah.
And what about the argument, I'd like to plow, but there's no place, I'd like to shovel, there's no place for me to put it. Now, there's a point, if you're in the inner cities, the snow plows have already shoved as much snow and embanked as much snow as they could, leaving you no place to
Well, in
put
fact,
that
that's what
snow.
happened.
So what do you do?
That's
Right.
what was happening. Because there's so much snow that fell over the last week, even though people had cleaned their sidewalks, the plow would come by, and then it would dump snow all
Right
over
back.
And what
again.
happens if somebody slipped, fell, or had a problem during the time I did initially shovel it, it got filled back in, and I didn't get back out there because the snow plows did it at 2 in the morning and someone fell at 6, and I didn't get to get out there. Who's liable for that? I mean, you certainly would have a defensible case, I would say, wouldn't you? Or
That's-
do you not?
You're going back to what negligence
Yeah,
is
yeah.
and what was reasonable and prudent for that person to have done. If they cleared it and then somebody else covered it and they didn't have an opportunity to go back out and clear it again, then I think they have a pretty good defense. If they had every opportunity to clear it again and just didn't bother because they're saying, I did it once, I'm not doing it again, there may be a claim against them. And there's another interesting issue that was raised with me by an attorney in court today is there going to be liability for people who don't clear their roofs off and some roofs start collapsing and people get hurt or otherwise injured with things falling off of the roof?
Give the insurance company a reason to deny a claim.
And they will.
See, the
Right.
thing is, I don't think it's reasonable to expect somebody to climb on a roof and
Right.
have the snow removed, or even have to pay someone for that matter. Like I said, people don't have the financial resources.
Right. Well, it's an interesting question. It's
Yeah.
not one that we've really faced all that much
It
around here
will come.
before.
It will happen.
But there may be claims.
Yeah.
Well, presuming that the roof was built to code, not substandard,
Right.
they do what they can to try to get rid of some of that, but with the additional water on top of that snow, how much can it possibly support? So that'll be interesting to
And
watch.
there you go with the insurance company again, an
Well-
act of God.
Well, let's go back. There was a Massachusetts company, was it, that I saw where the roof collapsed?
In Easton.
But everyone got out.
Yes,
Let's say
yes,
somebody
yes.
didn't get out. Well, that company certainly, I believe, would have been responsible under their workers' comp statute for any injuries to the employees of that company. What if there was a visitor in there? Would they have been responsible to that person as an invited guest on their property? This is where it can become very interesting legally. This
What
is the
duty do
kind-
they expect?
Well, this is the kind of stuff I love as a lawyer, is to look in and say, all right, well, what kind of notice did they have that this might even happen? Apparently, in this case, there was some creaking, that's why everybody got out. But if there was no notice and all of a sudden the roof collapsed, what could they have done? What should they have done? Now, what if that happened to the building next to them already? Sort of like that car on the hill that saw one go down. And they had the same building built the same year, the same materials, and one's already collapsed. And now the next day, they're in their building and it collapses. Do they have liability now? Could be.
Well, they put on notice, probably.
That's exactly right. You have the notice. What would a reasonable and prudent business owner do? Maybe clean the roof off at that point?
See, everything's predicated on facts, and what we
Mm-hmm.
have to do is we have to go out and we have to find them.
Right.
Even if it means going out and interviewing people in the neighborhood.
And then you take those facts and apply it to the law, or apply the law to the facts and figure out, do we have a claim or not? So the ordinance in most cities and towns say, clear your sidewalks. That's what you should do. Do you have excuses because of the height of the snow, or the fact that the plows keep putting it back, or you're elderly, or you can't afford to hire someone? Those are facts that may come into play, but I think the bottom line is the ordinance requires you to do it.
Apparently, ultimately, it is the city or municipality that has to bear the brunt of a lawsuit if someone slipped and fell on the sidewalk of Providence. Well, if the owner is supposed to take care of it, I can see where the city or municipality is going to be saying, please do that, or
Right.
we're all going to be in trouble. So it's worth it for them to strongly enforce or
Yep.
do something to make sure that someone does
There's a
comply.
statute that talks about municipality liability for the maintenance of highways and sidewalks. And it requires you actually to give notice within a specific amount of time of any injury that occurred on the highway or the sidewalk. And even though the municipality delegates the responsibility to the homeowner to clear off the sidewalk, you're right, if someone got hurt on a sidewalk and they could have done something to make it safer, the city I'm talking about, and didn't, they may eventually be liable. So in the scenario where they're the ones who keep plowing the snow back onto the sidewalk, there may be liability. And it may be a very interesting situation. Maybe the sidewalk's not passable, now the person has to walk in the street. In Providence, there's a very strong likelihood, maybe that's not negligent because the person assumes the risk, they're going to fall into a pothole about the size of a Volkswagen Bug.
And they're there,
Yeah,
let me
and
tell you.
they are there.
I was driving there yesterday.
So there could be liability for that. So I urge the cities and towns to clear the streets or fill the potholes, and the neighbors and other people to help the elderly folks clear their
They
sidewalks.
triple their budget, too, at the
Right.
same time.
Apparently, in Boston, they said that they were going to be just strongly encouraging people to do it rather than just ticketing them to start. But considering how many of the cities and towns are in financial trouble, you would think that would be a quick source of revenue. But that was an editorial comment. But I would think that that would certainly be something that they would want to make sure, especially with this severe winter, that people would adhere to, because you can see already that a few suits are starting to
Yeah, as a municipal court judge,
go together.
I've heard it said by other municipal court
not
judges.
revenue officers.
We're not revenue enhancement officers.
Yes.
But we are law enforcement officers. You know, if someone's violating the rules, will I listen if there's a reasonable excuse? Of course we'll listen. But if you can do it, you should do it.
in the short amount of time, if you're a renter, are you responsible for that street sidewalk,
Yes,
or is it the owner of the property?
It depends on the lease.
It depends on the lease.
How's that
So
for
you
a
have to
quick answer?
you have to check.
Yeah,
Depends on the
well,
lease.
most people actually are probably month to month. And so if it's month to month and it hasn't otherwise been provided for, the owner of the property is always responsible for the property.
Good to know. Well, I think we're supposed to have an early spring, excuse me. I hope this has been helpful to you. Please stay tuned as our discussion of legal matters continues. Well, we have more